Those of you who followed me for a while know that I've spoken and written a lot about oikophobia, the hatred of home. But what about oikophilia, the love of home? Here's something that I recently wrote about that, though for this video I've had to make some small changes, otherwise this video would not be YouTube safe. But I will link to the full text in the description below. In order to understand why oikophilia, the love of home, is so important, we must understand the severity of current oikophobia, the hatred of home. Oikophobia, though of course it's very deplorable, is a normal part of the Western cultural fabric through the ages. It's a natural tendency that has come and gone within the West since antiquity. Some conservatives, in fact, resist this notion because it seems to blunt their attacks on cultural self-hate as something absurd and bizarre. They desire only foot soldiers rather than thinkers, a posture that does conservatism no favors. For if we wish to combat oikophobia, we must understand what it genuinely is. If we do not understand what it is, we might be tempted to restrict our reaction precisely to such attacks, believing that what is absurd and bizarre will eventually crumble under our withering fire. But this would be to misunderstand the historical moment in which we currently find ourselves, and thereby, to some degree, to fail to see what countermeasures are necessary in order to slow the social decline that we are currently witnessing. One such countermeasure is the embrace of positive visions, including precisely oikophobia's opposite, oikophilia, the love of home. It is because oikophobia has become so rampant as an ingrained part of our historical era that its counterweight, oikophilia, has grown into an even greater imperative. Oikophilia entails the love of a home, its accompanying friendships and rituals, the importance of religion, and it is the care of home through private associations and local charity rather than through top-down governmental control. But note that a moment ago I said slow, not stop, the decline, because I don't think that it can be stopped. That is to say, we must face the fact that a particular social paradigm is coming to an end, the fact that there is little future left for the post-war liberal order that most people of my generation and the one before had come to take for granted. It will still subsist, of course, to some extent. It will grow stronger and weaker in fits and starts, but overall, it will continue to decline. It is here that I remember others in history who have lived at similar historical moments, moments that may properly be called liminal. I think of Plato, who witnessed the collapse of Athenian power and the rise of moral relativism. I think of Juvenal and Tacitus, who witnessed the influx of Eastern religions into the empire and the collapse of traditional religious belief. I think of Augustine, who had to come to terms with not only a declining moral world, but a collapsing physical one as well. And I think of Maistre and his counter-revolutionary work as everything around him changed. I think of these gentlemen because they help us understand that we are not simply facing a warped view of the world, but the end of an era, the slow collapse of a social paradigm. We therefore do not only fight the oikophobia and the wokeism is basically oikophobia's latest iteration, we therefore don't only fight the oikophobia and the wokeism that we see all around us, although to be sure we do that as well, but we also devote ourselves to the positive, to building anew and to shepherding the old, that which can be saved, across the threshold of our liminal moment. It is here that I am more optimistic about my own country, the United States, than about Western Europe, in part because our conservative oikophilia here is still broad-based enough to win allies in high places, as can be seen in our recent electoral victory, and because it has a stronger religious foundation. But the oikophobes and the woke will carry on the battle, which is important to point out, lest we exult too much in our victory and grow complacent again. And Europe especially must be ready to form alternative sources of meaning, in no small part because of its demographic changes. Oikophilia is not atavistic, even if it maybe sometimes contains a touch of nostalgia, but it's rather a question of bringing across the threshold things and institutions that endure, and of gaining permanence and rootedness by being part of something permanent and rooted, while relinquishing those things, such as many educational institutions, that will not survive beyond the threshold. Those permanent things live on by continuing through us and our children, if we're lucky enough to have them. And so there is a symbiotic relationship that exists within oikophilia, in that the individual and the institution each ensure each other's existence. Oikophilia means that through the commonality of local institutions, we turn away from the hyper-individualism that characterizes all declining Western eras. Concretely, this means that we nurture those private associations that can survive the liminal moment. It means that we preserve the best of art and architecture while not being closed off to innovation. It means we build up new elites in place of the old, because every society will require elites, but we need better ones than those today that celebrate mediocrity because they themselves are mediocre. And it means that we raise lots of children with religious and spiritual ways of life. It also means that we ruthlessly turn away those immigrants who are hostile to the West. Every love, including the philia in oikophilia, has a negative side because it seeks to remove anything that is a threat to the object of the love. Even many immigrants who appear to embrace the West are plagued by real or perceived cultural memories, and these cultural memories tend to come to the fore whenever civilizational relationships take a turn for the worse, as invariably happens. Just as in the United States, people will move to Republican states from Democrat states because the former tend to be better run than the latter, or better managed, but even though as they move, they nonetheless continue to vote Democrat because this constitutes their unquestioned cultural memory. They'll say something like, or they'll think something like, my father was a Clinton Democrat, my grandfather was a JFK Democrat, and so it's not thinkable to them to vote for anyone but a Democrat. So too, a remarkable number of seemingly well-adjusted and westernized immigrants from a certain part of the world will turn on their adopted civilization when the Middle East flares up. It's important to note here that, although it may seem counterintuitive, keeping such people out is a part of love. But to return to the positive side of philia, among the aforementioned gentlemen in history, I think perhaps in particular of Augustine, who was confronted with the idea that the civilization in which he had lived his entire life was crumbling around him, especially with the shocking sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410. He does not always appear to have fully realized that an era was coming to an end, but his City of God was in part the response to and an attempted way out of that predicament. He sought to find a new source of comfort, a different morality, a source of salvation other than Rome. One of his efforts was to build local meaning in a morally declining empire. Something similar could also have been said, incidentally, of some of the Hellenistic schools about 700 years earlier, in particular Epicureanism and Stoicism. And I think that this is something that's worth emphasizing, especially Augustine's search for local meaning, because I think there should be something of that particular imperative in our modern oikophilia, because our modern oikophilia is something local, away from the depredations of empire, away from the overreach of our current elites. And it is here that, once again, not only the oikos, but the philia, the love, must be emphasized. Many academics, in particular, are afraid to use words like love, beauty, and truth, because using these words indicates a commitment, and that would be a thorn in the side of their usual moral and cultural relativism. They find it unscientific or unscholarly to use these words, but they don't realize that if a commitment to use them is unscientific, a commitment not to use them is just as unscientific, because to be scientific is to go where the evidence leads, and one must not exclude from the get-go the possibility that the evidence could lead anywhere, including to love and to commitment. In fact, oikophobes and relativists tend to define themselves by what they hate, oikophiles and the religiously inspired by what they love. Oikophobes feel the patriotic philia only insofar as they have radically changed the oikos, that is to say, only insofar as they are now loving a distorted version of the home, deluding themselves that, for example, to be genuinely and authentically German is to welcome foreign migrants, or that to be genuinely and authentically British is to prefer tandoori chicken. Similarly, the left in the United States has co-opted typical patriotic language through having distorted the oikos, through having changed the home, claiming, for instance, that criticizing Islam or wanting to restrict immigration is quote-unquote un-American, even though many of our founding fathers were vociferous in their critique of Islam, and even though there have been many restrictive measures regarding immigration in American history. Indeed, as I look at the precious old institutions that still exist, at the literature, the art, and the architecture that can still be found all around us, how can I not self-define primarily by love? How can we not be oikophiles? And how can we not want to carry across the threshold the object of our love? And so as we resist oikophobia and social decline, and as the foot soldiers are sent out, let us not forget the constructive side of such resistance, because this really is what oikophilia, love of home, means, or what it should mean, namely the search for permanence and the ability to fall in love again.